All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Michelle Dimino, and I'm a Senior Education Policy Advisor here at Third Way. I'm excited to welcome you to the terrific conversation we have in store today with 4 expert panelists who will help us unpack what the past year of online learning has meant for higher education and what comes next. I can't wait to dive in, and we're so glad to have all of you here with us. Before we kick off our first panel, I'd like to run through some quick logistics. We have 2 mini panel discussions on tap today. Each will run about 15 minutes, and then we'll bring all 4 speakers together and save a good amount of time to address your questions at the end. We welcome you to submit questions at any point throughout the event using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. I also want to note that this conversation is on the record and is being recorded, and the video will be posted on Third Way's website for you to refer back to and share with colleagues after the fact. Today's event is the latest in a series of virtual conversations the Third Way Education team has hosted with thought leaders in higher education during the COVID-19 era, and recordings of past events are available on our website as well, so we encourage you to check those out. And lastly, I want to flag that our team will be using the Zoom chat to share a handful of resources by our speakers during today's conversation, so be sure to keep an eye out for those links and bookmark them for later reading, because these folks are all doing really fantastic and interesting work on these topics. All right. So we are here today to talk about online learning and higher education. While online education had been on the rise for several years prior to COVID-19, as we all know, just over 1 year ago, the pandemic forced colleges and universities across the country to shift abruptly to emergency remote instruction, which then morphed into the first and only extended period of nearly universal distance learning of its kind. There have been positives that have come from that shift. More students and faculty have now experienced online education than ever before and gained more confidence with that mode of instruction. And we've collectively learned a great deal about what works, what doesn't, and what students need to be successful in distance education settings. But there have also been many causes for concern this year. Enrollment is down, particularly at community colleges. Student mental health has suffered. Ensuring access to necessary technology has been a persistent challenge, and equity gaps across the board have been exacerbated. Polling from Third Way and New America found that a substantial minority of college students were working part or full-time as essential employees during the pandemic. 4 in 10 students had to make significant out-of-pocket purchases to engage in remote learning successfully. And 1 in 3 students reported that they anticipate they will now need more time to complete college due to the pandemic, which highlights how the extent of the impacts of COVID-19 on higher education won't be fully understood for quite some time. In short, this year has raised many, many questions, and we're going to spend our time together this afternoon diving into a few of the most pressing issues with our speakers. So for our first mini panel, we have with us Jillian Klein and Dr. Shanna Jaggars. Jillian is Senior Vice President of Government and Regulatory Affairs for Strategic Education, where she works with internal and external partners on higher education policy, post-secondary innovation, and federal financial aid compliance on behalf of Capella University and Strayer University. And she was part of the team that created Capella's FlexPath direct assessment program offerings, including the first bachelor's and master's level programs approved to receive federal financial aid from the Department of Education. Shanna is the Assistant Vice Provost of Research and Program Assessment in the Office of Student Academic Success at The Ohio State University. Her research focuses on university programs, services, and policies that aim to improve student success. And she has published extensively on topics related to student success in higher education and is an associate editor of the journal Online Learning. Jillian, Shanna, thank you both for being with us, and let's get started. So it was just over a year ago that colleges faced the sudden pivot to emergency distance instruction. 1 year later, what are some of the elements that we've learned are critical to high quality learning and student success in the online environment? And Shanna, let's start with you.
Okay, well, first, I'd say there are some things that are important to high quality learning in any class that are regardless of whether it's online or in person. And then there are some things that are particularly important when you're online. So I think the things that are always important, a lot of people are already aware of. So it's things like using real world examples and applications in class, creating opportunities for students to connect and learn from each other, that sort of thing. But what studies found is that last spring, faculty who were good at doing those things in person were sort of at a loss about how to implement them online. And faculty were also worried about their students and they wanted to give them flexibility. So they tended to drop the interactive components of their course and replace them with more independent work. So a lot of faculty replaced face-to-face time with busy work, or assignments, which makes students spend sort of more time and effort on coursework, but they don't improve learning or performance. So that tended to undermine some other things that are particularly important to online learning. So in an online course, because students have fewer natural opportunities to form connections with their peers and their teacher, the instructor needs to be a lot more proactive in making these connections and interpersonal supports. And so this includes things like incorporating empathic messages into course communications, messages of caring, connecting students to relevant resources and supports that you see that individual might need, providing quick, detailed, meaningful feedback, and offering live online sessions, which might be required or just optional, in which students can ask questions or participate in discussions. So all of these things require a lot of work. So it's entirely understandable that faculty really struggled to do some of these things last year, especially since they were also dealing with a pandemic and childcare and homeschooling. But that gives you a sense, ideally, of what we would be shooting for in online classes.
Great, absolutely. Jillian, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, just totally echo those answers. I mean, I think we can break it into two buckets, right? Which is what happens in the course room as we think about making sure faculty are well versed in the modality that they're using to teach to their students. So make sure they're aware of what the technology is, make sure that they have experience and confidence in those tools that can really help support the teaching and learning that's happening. And certainly, ideally, that curriculum is built for an online experience. So thinking about using multiple ways to assess learning in multiple different ways. So maybe in a course or in a program, that learning is tested multiple times to make sure students are acquiring those skills that are necessary to move forward. Using authentic assessments, which ensures that students are able to show competency in the areas that they'll need to master in order to be in a professionally relevant field once they graduate. And really using that technology infrastructure to support students. And the pivot from that is making sure that that online experience has a robust wraparound support that extends beyond faculty. So students should never be left to feel like they're learning on their own. And that doesn't mean just the faculty experience in the course room. It also means coaches, it means tutors, it means librarians all working together to make sure that students are removing the roadblocks. And especially in that online format, you run the risk of students who are quiet or who are falling behind because you're not face-to-face with them. Institutions really have to take that step to make sure that they're almost incessantly staying on top of students to make sure that they're not stumbling or falling behind, especially during a global pandemic, but anytime really.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I want to stay on the topic of faculty and institutional role and sort of training them for a moment. So as you mentioned, for many faculty members, this was really their first foray into online instruction, and there's definitely a learning curve there. What are some of the best practices that you've seen emerging at the institution level for supporting faculty training and providing development for online and hybrid teaching, as well as for some of those instructional support staff and academic advisors who help students through their journey? Shanna, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I think it's helpful to note that in the past, most colleges have sort of segregated their face-to-face versus online students and programs. So they had face-to-face programs where they, of course, provided a lot of in-person supports, extracurriculars for students, but they generally didn't require much or any training or professional development for faculty in terms of how to teach in-person courses. And then colleges have online programs, and for those, they provide separate remote student supports. They usually don't have much in the way of extracurricular activities, but they do have a pretty good framework of professional development for teaching. They're more likely to require teachers to participate in instruction around teaching. And what we saw in the pandemic is that the colleges, which did the best job pivoting to create more robust student supports and programming and instructor training, were those that first had already invested in online programs and supports prior to COVID-19 and had more integration between their online versus face-to-face staff and structures. So in colleges that did the pivot really well, we found that all students, even the ones who were usually in in-person program, benefited from a lot of the virtual support services. So for example, Zoom-based advising appointments. They worked just as well as in-person ones, and they were more convenient and more efficient for both the advisor and the student. So the colleges that had robust training for their online faculty were able to sort of quickly sort of swoop in and use that packaged content and sort of adjust it to the faculty who are sort of newly moving into this position in a way that sort of helped onboard them. Whereas colleges that didn't have that infrastructure in place had a lot of difficulty trying to pull that together. And the takeaway here is that institutions might consider sort of moving away from this siloed model in which they have a small group of staff that work exclusively with their fully online students and move towards a more integrated model in which the knowledge and the skills regarding virtual learning are sort of spread across the entire institution. And so, moving ahead, it's after the pandemic is over, it's not that we would want to reduce in-person options and supports and instructor training and so on, but instead, we want to take those virtual supports and extracurriculars and trainings that have now been developed, make sure that they are available to everyone and that they're well coordinated with the in-person options that we will also go back to. And that way we have that flexibility and convenience for both the instructors in terms of training and the students in terms of supports.
Absolutely. I think flexibility has been the word of the year in many ways. Jillian, anything else you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, I think echo Shanna's comment earlier about making sure that faculty members are trained and invested in creating and fostering relationships with their students to support learning. And that's a different experience when you're in an online environment than it is when you're in a classroom. I think often what we've seen is faculty training has been just in time, and it's been mostly about the technology, and certainly that's an important leg in terms of thinking about training for online learning, but it's also just as important or even more important to make sure that those faculty are equipped to build those relationships with their students to help them move through their programs. Certainly then that leads to some frequent, robust, excessive interactions with students to make sure that they're moving through their programs. And, I'd say something maybe a little bit provocative, which is that the best on-ground faculty members are not always the best online faculty members. So certainly institutions that are thinking about scaling an online program should think carefully about what competencies and skills might make up a great online faculty member and really build job descriptions in a way that support that, knowing that you might have to find sort of a whole different batch of faculty to support your online offerings.
Thank you. So the experiences of the past year have also shown a brighter light on the scope of the inequities that we see in higher education, including the digital divide and students' varied access to broadband and high-speed internet. In addition to internet access, our polling with New America found that, for instance, among students who had to make purchases for their own online learning, 44% had to buy laptops or computers, 27% needed headphones or microphones, another 24% needed to buy printers, among other things. How has this inadequate access to technology impacted students' ability to participate in online learning during the pandemic? And how have colleges been working to help address those gaps?
So we found in some work that we did that last spring around maybe 16 to 19% of college students had inadequate technology for full participation in online learning. So this might be things like having a slow internet connection or using your cell phone as your primary device for classwork. And we saw these technology inadequacy rates were higher for Black and Hispanic students, for low-income students, and for those from rural areas. But even after controlling for that demographic background, students with inadequate technology were more likely to struggle academically in their online courses. They also had a steeper decline in their sense of success as college students. Now, almost all college students had that sense of decline, but it was much steeper for those who had inadequate technology. And so in order to support these students, most colleges across the country had like loaner laptops or loaner hotspots programs for their students, but they usually only had a small number available, and it was hard for colleges to know whether they were accurately identifying the students who really needed that equipment the most. So as another option, a lot of colleges also negotiated with vendors to provide free or discounted equipment. Again, it wasn't always clear if the students who needed those the most were aware of those programs. At Ohio State, we had already provided sort of a basic floor of technology. All of our incoming freshmen had already received a free iPad with pencil, keyboard, and a curated set of academic apps. And a lot of students told us that this was a lifesaver in the pandemic, but our iPads were wireless only. And in normal times, that makes a lot of sense. Wireless is free, it's abundant in and around campus, but when students were sent home, if they went home to rural areas where there's no high-speed wireless, it becomes kind of like a big, expensive paperweight. So what would have really helped students is a more robust wireless infrastructure for communities across the country. And that's something that universities can help partner on and have been, but they can't really take responsibility for doing that on their own.
Absolutely. Jillian?
Yeah, I not much more to add to what Shanna said, I think, except that, I think this has also provided an opportunity for institutions to think about the ways that they can best support students, and especially students that are often juggling multiple priorities. They might be taking care of their families, maybe they're adults, maybe they're working in part or full time. And so for them, they need to have access to education that is flexible, that perhaps is available at night or on the weekends. And part of that is sort of the broadband and technology conversation, but part of it is making sure that as institutions, we're staffed in a way to support students during that time. Before the pandemic, certainly for us, students would often come to our campuses. And if it wasn't to take a course, it was literally just to have a quiet place to sit and do their homework, to access the internet. And so thinking about all of that shifting to where students are today means that we as institutions owe it to them to be sort of filled with grace and more accommodating to those students, which I think is probably something that's always been needed, but this highlights the opportunity, I think, broadly of how institutions can really make sure that we're removing that friction and providing the most flexible and accessible option for students as they're moving through their program, whether that's during a pandemic or not.
Definitely, thank you. So I have one more question for both of you, and then we'll reconvene for the Q&A. I would love to hear some examples of innovations or new research related to online learning and distance education, either at your institutions or others that you're aware of, that you feel like college leaders and state and federal policymakers should be taking note of. And Jillian, I'll give that to you first.
Sure. So a couple of things come to mind. I think at our institutions, we've invested heavily in increasing the use of video by faculty, providing faculty sort of state-of-the-art communication tools that they can use to engage with students, and that students can also use to engage with other students, because we know that there's a level of stickiness that comes with peer interaction as a student's moving through their program, even and especially when it's online. And we've added elements into our course room that allow for an increase in that engagement to the extent that students feel that that's something that's important for them. I think there's also a movement in online programs to incorporate gamification, which encourages students to keep coming back every day to their courses, even if it's not sort of a teaching and learning day, or if there's not assignments due, as a way to keep them engaged in their courses and moving through their programs. We at Taela released an outcomes paper a couple years ago on our FlexPath program, which is a competency-based education program where we've been able to really tailor a personalized and flexible experience for our students, and have some learnings from that and some things that we're still not sure about, right? Which an example of that would be the use of a faculty team or a disaggregated faculty model, which is often used now in online offerings versus having a single faculty member in the course. There's pros and cons to both, and certainly as institutions really work to scale online programs, those are some of the things that they'll need to wrestle with in terms of what that model looks like, and which model best supports students as they're moving through their program. And then I would say, I think it's going to be a while before we know exactly what the impact of the pandemic is to distance education. I think there's a risk that we sort of conflate emergency online learning and distance education. And there are public policy implications to that. There are certainly implications as we think about students who maybe are graduating from high school now and have had a couple of years of really non-traditional and in some cases, unfortunately, sort of substandard online learning, who may be turned off from online education in general. And so I think as we think about what the next version or the next generation of online learning will look like, it's incumbent on all of us to make sure that we're building programs that are really engaging for students and also providing them with those professionally relevant skills that they'll need when they graduate.
Great, thank you. And I'll flag that, as mentioned in the chat, we have links to the report that Jillian mentioned on Capella's FlexPass program, as well as some of Shanna's work on these topics as well. Shanna, any final notes you'd like to add?
Well, I'd say that regardless of the difficulty that faced me and many other instructors when we moved to sort of a quick pivot to online learning last spring, from a researcher perspective, it was really exciting because online learning in the past has been almost entirely asynchronous. So, instructors and students are on at different times. There was hardly any live synchronous online learning before last year, where instructors and students all log in at the same time to ask questions or have discussions. And so it will be really interesting to see what we are learning about the sort of new modality of live online coursework. And the research that we have on it now, which you can see in the chat, that we published a special issue on the emergency transition to online learning in the Online Learning Journal just this month. The research that we have in that issue is focused on the emergency transition last spring. So, as Jillian noted, we don't necessarily want to generalize that research to, all online learning or all live online learning. But I'm really excited to see, in the fall, as people were in a little bit more of a stable mode, what kind of research will come out from the fall semester. Because I think if we can understand how live online coursework compares to traditional asynchronous online coursework and in-person instruction, and whether it's pros and cons and where is it really good and useful, that kind of research could help institutions understand, is this an option that they might want to continue to mix in after most classes return to in-person instruction. So really excited to find out what we learn there.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect note to wrap up on for now. So thank you, Shanna and Jillian. We'll have you turn your cameras off for now and rejoin us in a little bit at the Q&A. So for those tuning in, make sure to submit your questions for Shanna and Jillian using the Q&A button before you forget. In our second panel, we are going to turn to the market for online education, including the shift and the growing role of online program managers as institutions continue to build out their online program offerings. To queue up that conversation, Third Way would like to share with you a new video explainer on OPMs that we are releasing right here, right now. So take a look.
It's Ben's first day of classes. He's enrolled in an online degree program from a respected public university and is excited to build skills for his career. But there's something Ben doesn't know. While his program is supposedly run by the public university whose name it bears, behind the scenes, there's another major player involved, an online program manager, or OPM. OPMs are for-profit companies that colleges can contract with to help them offer online courses and degrees. They provide a variety of services, from developing the online learning platform, to marketing the program, to recruiting students, or even designing the academic curriculum itself. And as participation in online higher education continues to grow, OPMs are more in demand than ever. Yet there's a lot that students and taxpayers who foot the bill don't know about OPMs. And from what we do know, there are some big risks. For example, under some contracts, an OPM's payout is based on how many students they recruit and enroll, which opens the door for predatory recruiting and excessive spending on marketing, rather than on actually serving those students. But wait a second. Ben did his research. He spent a lot of time on the program website, and there's no reference to an outside company, not even a logo. Plus, no one he's spoken to ever disclosed they didn't actually work for the university. That's because they don't have to. There are currently no federal regulations in place that require transparency from colleges about working with OPMs. So while hundreds of schools have agreements with an OPM to deliver thousands of online courses, often taking in more than half of a program's tuition revenue in return, students and taxpayers are left in the dark about who's really behind the education for which they're paying. Students deserve to know if their school is outsourcing to an online program manager. As a start, Congress should institute disclosure requirements for colleges working with OPMs and increase oversight to protect online students and the billions of taxpayer dollars that are following them. To learn more, visit thirdway.org/education.
Great, thank you, team. Now I'd like to invite Justin and Taela to turn on your videos. Perfect. I'm joined now by our second mini panel with Taela Dudley and Dr. Justin Ortagus. Taela is a senior policy associate on the higher education team at the Century Foundation, where her work focuses on curbing systemic inequity through ensuring high quality education for all students. And she has researched and written on the landscape of the OPM industry during her time at the Century Foundation. Justin is an assistant professor of higher education policy and administration and the director of the Institute of Higher Education at the University of Florida. His research examines how online education, community colleges, and state policies impact the opportunities and outcomes of underserved students in higher education, and he's published widely across those areas. Thank you both for being here. Now, we just got a backgrounder about OPMs and what they do from Third Way's video. My first question, and Taela, I'll send this to you first, is how has the landscape for OPMs shifted since the pandemic began? And what does the market look like for OPM services going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. And also I'll say that that was an awesome video that really touched on all of our primary concerns around OPM. So that was awesome. Yeah, so since the pandemic has started, the market for OPMs has definitely shifted favorably, I would say, for OPMs. I'd imagine that OPMs are in much greater demand now than before for several reasons. So of course you have schools that are seeking to recover from the loss of revenue that they faced from the dips in enrollment at the start of the pandemic and during the pandemic. And they may be looking to online programs as cash cows to rapidly generate that revenue. And you have OPMs here who are offering to help them rapidly expand online and often covering the upfront costs required to do that. You also have enrollment that has gone up generally at predominantly online institutions, even though enrollment on a national scale has dropped. And so you'll have traditional brick and mortar schools that are trying to keep up with the online schools, the mostly online schools, and they might be doing this by seeking the help of an OPM. And then finally, you have newly realized potential of online learning in general, and the realization that there are a lot of additional supports and challenges in expanding online that schools may not have realized before. And so they might seek outside help to have some of those supports and resources.
Justin, anything to add about the shifting market for OPMs?
Yeah, just broadly, I would say it shifted favorably toward OPMs, given that we have this shift toward emergency remote instruction or fast-paced shifts to future online education options. A lot of institutions don't really have the infrastructure or aren't prepared to make those really extreme shifts. So OPMs can offer value in that way. I also share many of the concerns you've outlined in the video because even well-intentioned institutions, or maybe there are good intentions on kind of like the perspective of the purpose of what's taking place there, when you introduce sometimes perverse incentives to just try to ramp up enrollment or whatever is clouded as access to higher education, sometimes the student is left in an unfavorable position, and institutions financially are left in these kind of like extreme contracts. We have this long-term commitment to something that might not make financial sense beyond the period of a pandemic. So your broad question about the landscape, it's really moved favorably. And I would urge college leaders and policymakers to think deeply about, is this something that we need to be as reliant on once you get beyond the pandemic period?
Absolutely. And as you touched on, there are a lot of questions and concerns, specifically within the OPM industry, about how incentives are structured in these partnerships between OPMs and institutions. Taela, you've looked at several contracts between schools and OPMs. What are some of the biggest questions that those contracts have raised, especially when it comes to those enrollment incentives and transparency in online courses?
Yeah, So Justin alluded to some of the concerns already, but I would say our major concerns are who's in control, who's managing the academics, who's doing the student recruitment, and ultimately how are dollars being used, where are dollars going? And these questions are exacerbated when it's a revenue share agreement, as the video explained, because this could incentivize these profit-oriented entities who have direct access to tuition. It could incentivize dollars being put before students or just turning students into dollar signs. And often these revenue share agreements are also bundled service arrangements, which is when the OPM manages almost all of the program. And so in these bundled service arrangements, you will often have the OPM running the student recruitment, using its own employees, its own call centers, even its own script sometimes. And this is concerning because we've seen some OPMs exhibiting recruitment practices that mirror aggressive recruiting that we've seen at predatory colleges. For instance, the landing pages of the websites for some of the programs that these OPMs manage, they require you to put in your personal information before you can see anything about the program. And then immediately upon putting in your contact information, you're contacted by an OPM employee, but under the guise of university representative, and they don't disclose that they are with the OPM. We also saw a contract that specifically instructed its agents to contact prospective students 13 times within a span of 10 days. And this style of aggressive recruiting is very similar to what we've seen at predatory colleges historically. And so it's very alarming that you'll have these practices spread to other bundled service arrangement. You'll often see the OPM managing program development, which is often so broadly defined that it can range from decisions around program operations, like maybe number of courses in a program, but it could also include curriculum design and development. Some contracts do make it clear when it's the institution that's supposed to be designing the curriculum, but in contracts that don't, it really raises the question of who's supplying the program content. Along the lines of program development, you'll also have contracts that allow OPMs to form steering committees with the program administrators. And this gives the OPMs mutual decision-making power, or this allows for mutual decision-making power around key administrative elements in the programs, like setting enrollment targets, making changes to course offerings, and even deciding the program budget. And so this raises major issues around governance and who's really in control of the program. We feel that a third party should not have any say on these key program elements. This governance should not be shared in this way. And then also in bundled service arrangements, you can have the OPM going as far as hiring and training the instructors for the program. So on a final note, along with governance and control, you have what Justin touched on. You have questions on who's in control of the exit terms and the actual term length of the contract. We saw a lot of tuition share contracts where it was very difficult for the school to exit the contract. It would be long contract lengths, maybe 5 to 10 years, that come with some pretty severe exiting penalties. And so that leaves the school really at a disadvantage if things are problematic. And then so ultimately, the biggest question here is how are taxpayer dollars being spent, particularly in these bundled service arrangements where so many of the operations are run by a third party. it could really lead to a black box where it's unclear how program decisions are being made and whether what the school is paying through its revenue share, whether that is actually reflective of the cost of each service that is looped into the bundle. One school that we spoke to that was in a tuition share bundled service agreement was not even aware of all of the services that it had contracted for that we identified in its contract. And so that raised the question of whether that school was paying for services that it did not even use.
Great, thank you. I think that points to a lot of the risks that are involved that we're still continuing to learn about too, with these sort of partnerships. And I'll flag too that Taela's work with the Century Foundation reviewing some of those OPM contracts is in the chat for you to take a look at. Justin, I want to touch on something that you've written about for Third Way. So when students especially talk about online education, I think there's often an assumption that it should cost less than face-to-face education. So is that a misconception? And what do cost structures actually look like for institutions that are developing and delivering online courses and degrees?
Yeah, I want to super briefly connect to what Taela was just describing, and then I can kind of like bridge into this larger answer to your question. But some things that really are difficult to convey oftentimes when you're an institution thinking about online education is that, let's say you have a biology professor. That biology professor is not an expert in the provision of online education. And so when Taela is talking about, potentially online program management entities controlling the curriculum, that's actually terrifying because they're also similarly not experts in biology and they should not be making content decisions. So that kind of speaks to this larger conversation about why is it expensive? And why can it cost more or as much as face-to-face instruction? I think that online education can absolutely cost less, but there are going to be some substantial quality implications in association with that. So typically, if you're thinking about high quality online education, they're going to have higher fixed costs or higher upfront costs. You're working with all these different personnel at the institution, whether it's instructional designers, multimedia specialists, folks who really are helping you kind of design and develop those online courses, working hopefully with faculty to be thoughtful about the quality of those courses. And then you still hopefully have the same high quality faculty who sometimes are high salaried or high wage individuals who are teaching those online classes. I'd be a little concerned, earlier like reference this point that about not every face-to-face instructor is a great online instructor. And I do agree with that overarching point. But I would be concerned if certain types of faculty or the superstars are teaching face-to-face and they're not teaching online. That really does create kind of like modality kind of differences there with about not where it's not just the type of instruction, it's also who's teaching the course and who's an expert in their field. So it can have higher fixed costs. It can also potentially online education have lower variable costs. So if you continue to offer the similar or same online courses over the years, you could potentially save over time once it's developed. But to develop, it's very expensive and you're working with expert faculty. So even if you have, let's say, already have some learning management system in place or course infrastructure in place, again, you still have expensive faculty, you still have the same wraparound support and services, hopefully, if you're concerned about quality that were mentioned earlier. So I guess the big takeaway is it's expensive early on, higher fixed costs, and it takes some time to recoup those additional costs through revenue and downstream savings. So that's the high level takeaway there.
Super interesting, thank you. Sort of tied to some of the expectations that are held about cost and value that you just touched on, online education still does face a bit of an image problem. In a Third Way poll that we did late last year, more than half of college students and nearly 60% of college-bound high school seniors agreed with the statement that higher education is not good quality now that it has moved partially or entirely online. I'd love to hear what are some of these specific concerns around quality that you feel that institutions need to address as many of them work to continue to grow their online offerings post-COVID. Justin, I'll throw that to you first.
Sure. There's a boatload of research suggesting that whenever folks who take online courses typically have negative short-term outcomes. And I think that's potentially building into these larger conversations about concerns about quality. And those are often, there are also some high quality studies in there, and there's reasons to have some concern or caution. My big takeaway is that design matters. And we talked earlier about all these kind of design components of courses. And then whenever we assess the value or the effect of enrolling an online course, we look at someone who's going face-to-face for a 3-hour course, and then kind of like a video stream or a recording of the same courses, throw that online and say online's worse than face-to-face. This to me is deeply troubling, because that's not actually providing valuable insights as far as the modality of online instruction and how do we get it right? How do we implement design components that really do have a positive or at least kind of like neutral impact on quality? So I would say one big takeaway there is that there are rightful concerns about online education if it's not done well, and you force students to be self-directed learners, and they don't have those wraparound supports. They don't have the faculty-student interaction that would be important for both face-to-face and online learners. I do think online education in those scenarios can exacerbate equity gaps and would be concerning. If you're thoughtful about design and implement some of these decisions that we've talked about today, I think online education has a huge potential to remove these time constraints, location constraints facing students, and allow them to make progress toward a degree. And I have a study out there kind of like showing this kind of general takeaway that although prior work has shown that they may be more likely to get a C+ or a B- rather than a B- or a B+ in specific courses or short-term courses, community college students in particular, if they take some online courses, not all, but some online courses, they can also be more likely to graduate and less likely to drop out because they're making progress toward their degree and keeping that academic momentum. So I think it's a little bit more nuanced and complicated to just say online is bad and kind of run away. I think that it's important to think about these complexities and have serious conversations about design and move that into how do we get it right.
Absolutely. Taela, anything you'd like to add there?
I'll just emphasize that true online learning should not be confused with the temporary turned long-term measures of going online that we saw throughout the pandemic that a lot of schools had to resort to, of just teaching classes on Zoom or just throwing a video online. Because yes, as many of the panelists have already alluded to, online is a specific format that needs supports that are specific to that format, and calls for different supports that in-person learning does not necessarily call for. And so can be argued that it could be just as costly as in-person. Whether those costs are passed down to the student, that could look different from institution to institution.
Great, thank you both so much. We are going to move over into our Q&A section now. So Shanna and Jillian, we'd love to have you turn your cameras back on as well. Great. So we have some questions from the audience. Our first one is for Jillian. So what competencies or skills have you identified to be the most useful when hiring online faculty, per your earlier point that these might look different than face-to-face instruction?
Sure. So I guess first I would say that, many faculty members don't have experience as learners in an online setting. If you think about the educational experience that some of our faculty members have, they attended school maybe in a more traditional setting. And so they fundamentally wouldn't necessarily be able to draw on their experiences as a student in an online setting to inform their work as an online faculty member. So I think we're always seeing advantages if our instructors also have the opportunity to be students in the format that they're teaching. The best online instructors understand how the intersection of technology and pedagogy and learning content can provide meaningful learning experiences for students and how to engage students in that work. Sometimes that means engaging students one-on-one, sometimes that means in a group setting, and it's on that instructor to sort of determine what the best approach is, given the tools that they have and their responsibility to provide active facilitation to their students. And we look for faculty who are deeply skilled in providing a personalized learning experience to students, especially at a distance. If this isn't done well, then certainly students run the risk of being left to learn on their own or feeling like they're left to learn on their own, which is a risk for students in an online setting if instructors don't do it well.
Great, thank you. We have a few questions here about OPMs. So Taela, I'll give these to you first. One asking, are OPMs more prevalent in one sector of higher education versus another? So do we see that highly selective R1 institutions are using them as much as other types, or any trends in terms of who's contracting with OPMs?
Yeah, so unfortunately, because our only route of obtaining contracts from schools that work with OPMs is through the public records requests. Our sample just consists of contracts with public institutions, but just from information that OPMs publish on their websites, like 2U, for example, has a whole list of schools that they partner with. We do know that contracting is prevalent across all sectors, probably the public and nonprofit sectors, maybe more so than for-profit. I would imagine just knowing that for-profit institutions have had a longer history being online, I would imagine they would not need to contract with online third parties as much, although I can't say for sure. But I do know that in both the nonprofit and public sectors, it's prevalent.
Thank you. And one more question on OPMs. So it sounds like there is a lot to be wary of in terms of the risks of those contracts. Is there any good that can come from contracts with OPMs or potential areas of opportunity with OPMs and the expertise that they hold in a post-COVID world?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely true that if the OPMs are not being incentivized by profit, that their services do offer efficiency and can help schools get off the ground faster and maybe in a more cost-effective way than if the schools had to upfront everything themselves. It's just, as of right now, because there's so little knowledge around what is being spent on the services that OPMs offer, it's hard to tell, but efficiency, it would definitely be the benefit here.
Great, thank you. Another one that came in, I'll ask this to all of you. So are you more or less optimistic about the future of online education than you were a year ago? Justin, I'll send it to you first.
Gentlemen first. Okay, so I would say I am more optimistic, but I think it's kind of like gone from the margins to mainstream in kind of like an unfortunate way with the pandemic. But I do think there are serious conversations about it did not go well oftentimes for this kind of like immediate shift. And what did that look like? And how can we kind of do right by students who do enroll online? So before the pandemic was even happening, there are federal data showing that over 40% of students enrolled in at least one online course. It was already taking place, but now we're having conversations about, you know, how do we kind of like move from this emergency remote instruction dynamic to really implement online education in a really effective way. And I don't know that we know a lot about, you know, empirically and having causal tests of design elements that work really, really well in online classes. So that shift to that type of conversation and what we need to know better, to me, gives me hope that there can be some evidence-based practices to move forward and kind of identify how do we get this right. So overall, I think that's a good thing.
Okay, Jillian, more or less optimistic about online education?
Yeah, I'm with Justin. I think I'm feeling more optimistic as well, for many of the same reasons. I mean, I think for us as working at adult serving institutions, we know that for busy students, adults and, you know, young adults, as they're balancing multiple priorities, online education has been one of their only options because they need flexibility. So to the extent that high quality online education continues to grow in a way that's personalized for students and provides flexibility for students to access at the time that they need to, I think that it can be a game changer for many students who maybe felt like they didn't have an option for education given the constraints that they were juggling as adult students.
Thank you. So we have two optimistics. Taela, what do you think?
I'm going to break the pattern and say that I'm feeling neutral. There is definitely great possibility for online learning to better serve students than it was before, but we really just need to know the outcomes of students from schools working with OPMs. It's a little too soon to tell. So the online learning has to be delivered in the right way.
All right, and Shanna, our potential tiebreak.
So, I mean, I think I'm feeling more optimistic, and I think that's because face-to-face learning has unique strengths. Online learning has unique strengths. And I think that this pandemic has helped bring these two sides of the university closer together so they can learn from each other and improve their own, pieces of the university. And it concerns me hearing about the OPMs because this is not actually something I knew much about before. So thank you, Taela, for giving me some perspective on this. It concerns me because, earlier I mentioned that the colleges who seemed to do best in the online pivot were the ones where they already had internal expertise in online learning and had sort of developed that and invested in it, and where there was more crossover between the online side of the college and the in-person side of the college. So if an OPM is if a college is outsourcing all of their online expertise to an OPM, then the college is not really learning from it or integrating and institutionalizing those lessons into the larger university. So if that is becoming a bigger trend, I guess I would start to maybe think I feel a little bit more pessimistic and more on Taela's side. So that's my hot take on that question.
Thank you. Thank you all for those answers and for participating today. I think that was a perfect question to sort of end on, and it highlighted both the opportunities and the risks and the questions that we still have about online education after this year that has given us more experience than we've ever had before with that modality. So a lot to stay tuned on going forward and to keep dialed into. These four are all doing terrific work in this area. As I've mentioned, there are links in the chat to work that they've done. And so we will wrap there. We will be posting this video in the next few days on our website. So do feel free to pass it along to colleagues and friends who you think would be interested in taking a look. And I will also note that our team is going to drop a quick survey link in the chat if you have a moment to respond and let us know what you thought of this program today and how we can improve. So thank you all so much for tuning in today. Thank you to our wonderful speakers for being with us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.